Home prices have now been rising across the United States for about the last 6 months. It's a small rise. We're in the low single-digit rise. We are seeing an increase, a rate of rise of home prices, which is going to be in the 3 to 4% annualized rate on a national level. That, too, creates urgency amongst buyers because no one wants to go out and shop in Macy's on the Sunday before Columbus Day if there's going to be a sale on Columbus Day, if you can buy it cheaper tomorrow. That's another hesitation that's been holding back the housing market. When buyers see that prices aren't going down but are starting to rise, and we're starting to see that even here in New Jersey, a little late, but primarily in the northeastern part of the state, a little late compared to the rest of the country, when prices start to rise, buyers feel more urgency, and with that, we're going to see that carry into the spring. Very impressive. Consumer sentiment, as measured by the University of Michigan in its annual survey, is at the highest level since before the recession began. The American people are starting to feel more positive about what happens next in their lives, in their jobs, in their earnings levels. And we've seen this play out in the presidential election recently, because prior to the last couple of debates, what we were hearing was that the president's ratings in the polls were rising, and then the sub-questions were, how do you feel about the economy? And there was more of a positive mood that was developing. Consumers are starting to believe that as slow as it's been, it has gotten better to some degree, and will probably recover even more going forward. There is that mood of optimism, very important as it affects housing markets and retail commercial real estate markets. Looking at what's happening in the housing market, this slide is actually mislabeled at the top. I'll correct that before I send that off to all of you. We're not looking at unsold inventory, we're looking at existing home sales, and existing home sales are now increasing. We're seeing the number of house sales that are occurring increase at an annualized pace of about 15%. More sales year on year, increasing demand. I'll revise that before I send it off to Chuck. In addition to having increasing sales of existing houses, and by the way, here we're looking at how that increase breaks out for all houses versus single family versus condominium, the improvement has almost entirely been occurring in the single-family detached housing market. We're not yet seeing recovery in the attached condominium and townhouse markets for the most part. There are some exceptions. Reasons are many. Home buyer preferences are, today's buyer says, if I'm going to buy today, given what I look at in my rearview mirror to what happened to the people who bought 4 and 5 years ago, I want exactly what I want, and I won't take anything less, and what they want is a single-family house at the price that they dictate. So, for the most part, attached housing is a secondary overflow, trickle-down kind of a market that feeds off of rising home prices for single family, and then buyers say, I want to buy, I can't afford a single, let me buy a multi. The other problem here is that we have extraordinarily difficult financing hurdles to get over in the condominium market because of FHA's changes in terms of rules, Fannie and Freddie, in terms of project approvals and which projects qualify based upon investor rates and primary occupant rates and what's happening in the HOA associations and delinquency rates there. And so the condominium market is continuing to struggle. Here's the best indicator that I can show you. National Association of Realtors has an index that they track, which they call the buyer index, and it is their measurement of how many buyers are actively out in the market shopping for a house to buy at any given point in time. Here you can see that at the start of the recession, the numbers began to decline in terms of the reading of how many buyers were out looking for housing. Here we see a surge, a plateau, and a fallback in late 2009 and 2010. What was that? Home buyer tax credits. Federal government offered one-time credits to stimulate demand. That demand stimulated, buyers came out and bought, and in April of 2010, which was when the final tax credit expired, buyer interest fell off the edge of the table, and the housing market went back into a coma. Now, more recently, look at what's happening in 2012, off the chart. When you look at the slope of that, look how steep that slope is, the rise over the run, right? You see how steep that slope is? That this slope is so steep, and this slope is not as steep, tells me that we've not yet seen the full extent of the buying surge that will play out in the spring. Buyers are circling. And here's what they're thinking. I want to buy. I think my job is more secure. Interest rates may be a little lower because I heard about this QE3 thing. Maybe I'll be able to, if I wait, get a better interest rate. That'll be in January. And then I wonder if prices are going to go up. When they see prices going up and they see that interest rate, it'll be the trigger point. The housing market will go into full-bore recovery starting in the first quarter of next year. Inventory of existing houses is down now to 6 months of inventory nationally. Statistically, the correlation between months of supply of inventory in a market and what happens to prices, the historical correlations are, when inventory goes above 8 months, home prices decline. When inventory goes below 8 months, home prices stabilize. When inventory goes below 6 months, prices rise. When inventory goes below 3 months, prices rise double digits, 10 to 15% a year. That's the historical correlation to what's happened historically on house prices based upon what was playing out in the supply and demand balance in a market. And so that we're under 6 months tells us why house prices are now starting to rise. New housing starts and completions are also starting to rise slower than the overall market. Why? Because house prices need to get a little higher before home building is profitable again. Construction costs have actually risen through the recession, and land acquisition costs have not dropped by as much as house prices. That means there's not a lot of profit in the home building market because existing home prices are so low. As existing home prices start to rise, that's going to open up the floodgates on new construction, and that's likely to happen in 2015 is when we'll see new home building get back in the game in a serious way. The inventory of new houses is at a record low, which means that once demand rises a little further, new construction is going to need to catch up, and we're going to see a significant number of housing starts. What does that mean? That means that absent these wild cards, the economy gets better from here, because housing is an engine for overall economic activity. A lot's been talked about delinquency and foreclosure. I can tell you that this problem is in its final days. We are in the final days of the foreclosure crisis. This map is showing you in the color white states which have less than 2% of their housing stock in delinquency or foreclosure. So that would include the shadow inventory. And it's about half of the country. About half of the country now is to the point that its foreclosure inventory has dropped so that it accounts for less than 2% of housing in a market. 1 out of every 50 homes or less. The areas that are in red and in this darker gray color have the higher concentrations. Florida and New Jersey, the two highest in the country, and then followed by places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana and South Carolina and New Mexico. So what we have here now is that this problem is already beginning to subside, and here's the reasons why. Delinquency is falling. Fewer homeowners are behind in their payments today than was the case back in 2011. Well, that just makes sense, doesn't it? Because if we're creating jobs and more people are going to work, then that better enables them to be able to make their mortgage payments. That's a part of it. As you'll see in a moment, the other reason that that number is improving is that there are so many loan modifications that are occurring, which are essentially cramming down, voluntarily though, so it's not a cram down. Big banks are out there going out to people and saying, listen, you bought your house for $400,000 with no money down. Today it's only worth $325,000. Here's what we're going to do for you. We're going to reduce what you owe us from $400 down to $310. You now have $15,000 equity in your house. And we're going to recast that lower amount of $310,000 of what you owe us from your current 6.5% rate, because you haven't been able to refinance because you've got terrible credit. We're going to refinance it for you at 3.5% or 4%. So your housing payments have essentially been cut in half. And we're going to do this, why? Because we agreed to a $25 billion settlement as part of the Foreclosure Act agreement with all the 50 states' attorney general, and we have to do it. And that's how we're going to satisfy that $25 billion obligation. You're going to see in a moment We had more than 400,000 of those voluntary principal write-downs occur in the first half of this year alone. By the end of the year, there will have been 1 million of them. And what that does is that takes a house out of delinquency and negative equity and puts a homeowner right side up with a payment that they can afford, and it erases it from the foreclosure shadow inventory. Do you understand that? Pretty smart solution.